Sarah Martinez woke up every morning at exactly 5:30. Her alarm clock was old and loud, but she never needed it. Her body knew when to wake up after 20 years of the same routine. She lived in a small apartment on Maple Street in the town of Millbrook. The apartment had one bedroom, one bathroom, and a tiny kitchen that smelled like coffee and old newspapers. Every morning, Sarah made her bed with perfect corners. She folded the sheets exactly the same way every single day. Her neighbors would have been surprised to know that she learned to make beds this way in the military, but Sarah never told anyone about her past. To everyone in Millbrook, she was just the quiet woman who worked at the electronics factory. Sarah worked the night shift at Henderson Electronics. She was a supervisor, which meant she watched over 12 other workers who put together computer parts and radio equipment. The job was not exciting, but it paid her bills. She could afford her small apartment, her old Honda car, and groceries every week. That was enough for Sarah. The other workers at the factory thought Sarah was nice, but strange. She never talked much during breaks. When someone made a joke, she would smile but not laugh out loud. During lunch, she sat alone and read paperback books about history and airplanes. Nobody knew why she liked airplane books so much. If they asked, Sarah would just say she found them interesting. Sarah had been working at Henderson Electronics for 15 years. Her boss, Mr. Henderson, trusted her completely. She never made mistakes, and she never called in sick. When new workers started at the factory, Mr. Henderson always told them to watch Sarah and learn from her. She knew how to fix any machine that broke down. She could read technical manuals faster than anyone. Sometimes she would look at a broken radio and know exactly what was wrong just by listening to it. What Mr. Henderson and the other workers did not know was that Sarah had once been Captain Sarah Martinez of the United States Air Force. For 8 years, she had been one of the best radar technicians and communication specialists in the military. She could guide fighter jets through storms and help lost pilots find their way home. She saved lives every single day, but that was a long time ago. Now, Sarah lived a quiet life in Millbrook and tried not to think about her military days. After work each morning, Sarah would drive home through the empty streets of Millbrook. The town had 3,000 people, 2 traffic lights, and 1 main street with a few shops. Everyone knew everyone else. Mrs. Chen, who owned the grocery store, would wave at Sarah when she drove by. Old Mr. Johnson, who sat on his porch every morning, would nod at her. Sarah would wave and nod back, but she never stopped to talk. Sarah lived next door to Mrs. Peterson, an elderly woman who had lived in Millbrook her whole life. Mrs. Peterson was 78 years old and lived alone since her husband died 5 years ago. Every Sunday morning, Sarah would knock on Mrs. Peterson's door and ask if she needed anything from the grocery store. Mrs. Peterson always had a shopping list ready. Sarah would drive to Chen's Grocery and buy everything on Mrs. Peterson's list. She would also buy her own groceries for the week. Always the same things: bread, milk, eggs, chicken, rice, and vegetables. Sometimes she would buy a chocolate bar, but she felt guilty about it afterwards. When Sarah brought the groceries back, Mrs. Peterson would invite her in for coffee. Sarah always said yes, even though she was tired from working all night. Mrs. Peterson would talk about her grandchildren who lived in the city and her garden and what was happening in town. Sarah would listen and nod and drink her coffee. Mrs. Peterson thought Sarah was just shy. She had no idea that Sarah was thinking about friends who died in Afghanistan and missions that went wrong and the sound of fighter jets in trouble. Sarah's apartment was very neat and clean. Everything had its place. Her books were arranged by size on a small shelf. Her clothes hung in the closet with all the shirts together and all the pants together. Her kitchen table was always clear except for 1 placemat and 1 coffee cup. But in Sarah's bedroom closet, hidden behind her winter coats, was a small wooden box. Inside the box were things that Sarah never showed to anyone. There was a folded American flag. There were photographs of Sarah in military uniform standing with other soldiers. There were medals and ribbons that the Air Force had given her for excellent service. There was a letter from a general thanking her for saving the lives of 6 pilots during a sandstorm in Iraq. Most important of all, There were two photographs of Sarah's best friends from the Air Force, Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez and Sergeant Tom Wilson. Both of them had died in the same mission that made Sarah leave the military forever. Sarah looked at their pictures sometimes when she could not sleep. She missed them every single day. The people of Millbrook saw Sarah as a mystery. She was polite and helpful, but she never shared personal information. She never dated anyone or went to the town festivals. She did not go to church or join clubs. Some people thought she was sad about something, but nobody knew what. Mrs. Peterson worried about Sarah the most. She could see that Sarah was lonely even though she never complained. Mrs. Peterson would invite Sarah to have dinner or watch television, but Sarah always said she was too tired. Mrs. Peterson wished Sarah would make more friends and be happier. What Mrs. Peterson did not understand was that Sarah was not just tired from working night shifts. Sarah was tired from carrying memories that felt too heavy to share. She was tired from pretending that Captain Sarah Martinez had never existed. She was tired from acting like she did not know how to save lives when people were in danger. Every night when Sarah got ready for bed, she would look out her bedroom window at the sky. Sometimes she could see airplanes flying high above the clouds, with their tiny blinking lights. Most people in Millbrook never paid attention to those lights, but Sarah knew that each light was a pilot flying somewhere important. She knew how to read the different types of aircraft by their lights and their sound. Sarah would watch the planes until they disappeared into the distance. Then she would close her curtains and try to sleep. But sleep did not come easily when your dreams were full of radio voices calling for help and the faces of friends who were never coming home. This was Sarah's life in Millbrook. Quiet, simple, and safe. Nobody suspected that the woman who supervised the night shift at the electronics factory had once been a hero who guided fighter jets through enemy territory and saved lives in 3 different wars. But secrets have a way of coming out when you least expect them, and Sarah's secret was about to change everything. October 15th started like every other Tuesday in Millbrook. Sarah finished her night shift at Henderson Electronics at 6 in the morning. She said goodbye to the day shift workers who were just arriving. The morning air was cool and smelled like autumn leaves. Sarah walked slowly to her Honda in the parking lot. Her legs were tired from standing for 10 hours, but she felt good about the work she had done. The drive home took Sarah through downtown, Millbrook. Main Street was quiet except for a few early workers opening their shops. Sarah waved at Mrs. Chen, who was putting fresh apples in the window of her grocery store. She drove past the small library and the post office and the diner where truckers stopped for breakfast. Everything looked normal and peaceful. Sarah parked her car in front of her apartment building on Maple Street. She could see Mrs. Peterson, watering plants in her window box. The old woman smiled and waved. Sarah waved back and grabbed her purse from the passenger seat. She was thinking about taking a hot shower and making scrambled eggs for breakfast before going to sleep. But as Sarah walked up the sidewalk to her front door, she heard something that made her stop completely. High above the morning clouds came, a sound that most people would not notice. It was the deep rumble of jet engines, but these engines did not sound right to Sarah's trained ears. Sarah had heard thousands of aircraft during her 8 years in the Air Force. She knew the difference between a commercial airplane, a cargo plane, and a military fighter jet. She knew what engines sounded like when they were working perfectly and what they sounded like when something was very wrong. The sound coming from above the clouds was definitely wrong. Sarah dropped her purse on the sidewalk and looked up at the gray morning sky. She could not see anything yet, but her heart started beating faster. The engine noise was getting louder and more irregular. There were popping sounds mixed in with the normal rumble. Sarah knew exactly what that meant. Someone up there was in serious trouble. Mrs. Peterson noticed that Sarah was standing very still in the middle of the sidewalk looking up at nothing. She opened her window and called out, "Sarah, dear, are you feeling all right? You look worried. About something." Sarah held up one hand to ask Mrs. Peterson to be quiet. She needed to listen carefully. The aircraft was getting closer and the engine problems were getting worse. Sarah could hear the pilot trying to maintain power but failing. This was not a small problem that could be fixed in flight. This was an emergency. Then Sarah saw it. A dark shape broke through the low clouds about 2 miles away. It was an F-16 Fighting Falcon, one of the Air Force's main fighter jets. Even from this distance, Sarah could see black smoke trailing behind it. The aircraft was flying too low and moving too slowly. The pilot was clearly struggling to keep control. Sarah's hands started shaking. She had not seen a military aircraft in distress for almost 20 years, but her body remembered everything. Her pulse quickened and her mind became very focused. All the civilian years melted away in seconds. Captain Sarah Martinez was back. The F-16 was heading roughly southwest, away from the nearest Air Force base. Sarah knew that base was more than 100 miles away. With engine problems this serious, the pilot would never make it that far. He needed to find somewhere to land immediately, but looking around at Millbrook, Sarah could not see any good options. Below the struggling aircraft were neighborhoods full of houses where families were just waking up. There were schools where children would start arriving in 2 hours. There were busy highways with morning traffic. There was the shopping center and the hospital and the retirement home where dozens of elderly people lived. Sarah ran to her apartment as fast as she could. She fumbled with her keys and burst through the front door. Mrs. Peterson was now standing on her porch, looking confused and worried. "Sarah, what is happening? Why are you running?" "There's an aircraft in trouble," Sarah called back as she rushed inside. "I need to help." Sarah went straight to her bedroom closet. She pushed aside her winter coats and reached for something she had not touched in 15 years. Hidden behind a stack of old blankets was a military field radio that Sarah had kept from her Air Force days. She was not supposed to have it, but when she left the service, nobody had asked for it back. The radio was heavy and black with lots of knobs and switches. Sarah carried it to her kitchen table and plugged it into the wall. Her hands moved quickly over the controls. She remembered exactly which frequencies the military used for emergencies. She remembered the call signs and the proper procedures. It was like riding a bicycle. Once you learned, you never really forgot. Sarah put on the headset and began scanning emergency channels. Static filled her ears, but she kept adjusting the dial. She was looking for any communication from the pilot in trouble. Military aircraft had multiple radios and backup systems. Even if his main communications were damaged, he should still have emergency frequencies working. Outside, Mrs. Peterson had called 2 other neighbors. They were all standing on the sidewalk looking up at the sky and talking in worried voices. The F-16 was now close enough that they could all see it clearly. The black smoke was getting thicker and the aircraft was definitely losing altitude. Sarah found the right frequency and heard something that made her heart jump. A young voice, tight with stress and fear, was trying to reach anyone who could. "Help him. Mayday, Mayday, this is Falcon 27. I have complete engine failure and I'm going down. Does anyone copy? I repeat, this is Falcon 27 declaring emergency." The pilot's voice was professional, but Sarah could hear the panic. Underneath, she knew exactly how he felt. She had talked to dozens of pilots in similar situations during her military career. They tried to stay calm, but they were human beings facing death. Sarah grabbed the microphone with both hands. She took a deep breath and spoke in the clear, confident voice she had used hundreds of times before. "Falcon 27, this is ground. Control. I copy your Mayday call. I have visual contact with your aircraft. You are currently over the town of Millbrook. Please respond if you can hear me." There was silence for several seconds. Then the pilot's voice came back, filled with surprise and hope. "Ground control, this is Falcon 27. Thank God someone is out there. I can barely hear you, but I copy. My engines are completely dead and I'm gliding on fumes. I need immediate assistance finding somewhere to put this bird down." Sarah looked out her kitchen window at the F-16 circling slowly above the town. The pilot was buying time while his aircraft lost altitude. He probably had less than 10 minutes before he would be forced to eject and let his multi-million-dollar fighter jet crash wherever it wanted to crash. Sarah spread her old military maps across the kitchen table and opened her laptop computer. She had work to do and not much time to do it. Somewhere out there was a place where that young pilot could land safely. Sarah was going to find it. Captain Martinez was back in action. Lieutenant Jake Morrison was 26 years old and had been flying F-16 fighter jets for 3 years. He loved his job more than anything else in the world. Flying was the only thing he had ever wanted to do since he was a little boy watching airplanes at his local airport. But right now, 30,000 feet above a small town he had never heard of, Jake was having the worst morning of his entire life. What started as a routine training flight had turned into a nightmare in less than 30 seconds. Jake was flying from Peterson Air Force Base to a training area in the mountains when his engine warning lights started flashing red. At first, he thought it might be a false alarm. Military aircraft had sensitive warning systems that sometimes gave alerts for small problems. But then Jake heard a loud bang from behind him. His F-16 shook violently and black smoke started pouring from his engine. The cockpit filled with the smell of burning fuel and hot metal. Jake's hands moved quickly over his controls, following the emergency procedures he had memorized in flight school. But nothing worked. His engine was completely dead. Jake tried to restart the engine 3 times. Each time the starter motor whined and clicked, but nothing happened. His backup systems were failing one by one. First, his main radio stopped working, then his navigation computer went dark. His fuel gauge was dropping fast because the damaged engine was leaking jet fuel into the sky. The hardest part was the terrible silence. Fighter jets are loud aircraft that roar through the sky with tremendous power. But now Jake could only hear the wind whistling past his cockpit and the occasional beeping of his emergency systems. His F-16 had become a very expensive glider that was falling toward the earth at 200 miles per hour. Jake looked down through his canopy at the landscape below. He could see a small town with neat rows of houses and tree-lined streets. There were schools with playgrounds full of bright-colored equipment. There was a shopping center with a big parking lot full of cars. Jake felt sick to his stomach when he realized that all those people down there had no idea that a fighter jet full of fuel and weapons was about to crash somewhere in their neighborhood. Jake had trained for emergency landings, but always over empty desert or ocean. He had never imagined trying to find a safe place to crash land in the middle of a populated area. Every option looked terrible. The highways were full of morning traffic. The fields were too small and surrounded by power lines. The residential streets were lined with houses where families were eating breakfast and getting ready for work and school. Jake's flight instructor had always told him that a good pilot never gives up until the very last second. So Jake kept flying in slow circles above the town, looking desperately for somewhere safe to put his aircraft down. But with each circle, his altitude got lower and his options got fewer. That was when Jake heard the most beautiful voice he had ever heard in his life. Falcon 2-7, this is ground control. I copy your Mayday call. I have visual contact with your aircraft. You are currently over the town of Millbrook. Please respond if you can hear me. The voice was calm and professional. It sounded like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Jake had been trying to reach air traffic control for 10 minutes, but his damaged radio could only transmit on emergency frequencies. Most people on the ground would not have the right equipment to hear his distress calls, but somehow this ground control person was listening. Ground control. This is Falcon 2-7. Thank God someone is out there. I can barely hear you, but I copy. My engines are completely dead and I'm gliding on fumes. I need immediate assistance finding somewhere to put this bird down. Jake felt a tiny bit of hope for the first time since his engine exploded. Someone down there was trying to help him. Someone who talked like they understood military aircraft and emergency procedures. Jake had no idea who ground control was, but their voice sounded confident and experienced. Falcon 2-7, I need you to give me your current altitude and airspeed. Also, tell me how much fuel you have remaining and whether your ejection seat is working properly." Jake checked his instruments and reported back. He was at 8,000 feet and falling. His airspeed was holding steady at 180 knots. He had maybe 5 minutes of fuel left. His ejection seat showed green lights, which meant it would work if he needed to abandon his aircraft. "Copy all, Falcon 27. I am working on finding you a suitable landing area. In the meantime, I need you to turn 15 degrees to your right and head northeast. This will take you away from the most populated areas while we find somewhere safe." Jake followed the instructions exactly. Ground control seemed to know the local area very well. Jake could see that the new heading was taking him over farmland and forests instead of neighborhoods and schools. Whoever was talking to him was thinking clearly and making good decisions under pressure. "Ground control, can you tell me who you are? Are you military air traffic control?" There was a pause before the answer came back. "Negative, Falcon 27. I am a civilian with military communications training. I happened to be monitoring emergency frequencies when I heard your distress call. Right now, the most important thing is getting you on the ground safely." Jake was amazed. Some civilian had the right radio equipment and knew how to use it. Even more amazing, they seemed to understand military procedures and aircraft emergencies. Jake had never heard of anything like this happening before. "Falcon 27. I have been studying maps of this area and I think I have found a possible landing site for you. It will require some precise flying, but I believe you can do it. Are you ready to copy coordinates?" Jake grabbed his pencil and prepared to write down whatever ground control told him. His hands were shaking from adrenaline, but his mind was focused. He was still in serious trouble, but at least now he was not alone. Someone down there was fighting to save his life. "Ready to copy, ground control, and thank you for being there. I was starting to think this was going to end very badly. We are going to get you home safe, Falcon 27. I promise you that. Now listen carefully because timing is going to be very important." Jake had never met ground control and did not even know if they were a man or a woman, but he trusted them completely. Their voice carried the kind of authority that came from real experience. Jake had heard that same tone from his best flight instructors. Ground control was someone who had done this kind of work before. Jake looked down at his fuel gauge one more time. The needle was almost touching empty. Whatever ground control had planned, it needed to happen very soon. In a few more minutes, Jake would have no choice but to eject and let his F-16 crash wherever it wanted. To crash. But for the first time since his engine failed, Jake Morrison believed he might actually survive this morning. Sarah's small apartment had become a military command center in less than 15 minutes. Her kitchen table was covered with maps, notebooks, and her laptop computer showing weather information and satellite images of the area around Millbrook. The old military radio crackled with static as she maintained constant communication with Lieutenant Morrison in the damaged F-16. Sarah had not felt this focused and alert in 20 years. Every instinct from her military training had come rushing back the moment she heard that young pilot's voice calling for help. Her hands moved quickly and surely over the maps as she calculated distances, wind speeds, and glide ratios. This was exactly the kind of work Captain Sarah Martinez had done in 3 combat zones. The only difference was that now she was trying to save one pilot instead of guiding entire squadrons through enemy territory. Outside her window, Sarah could see Mrs. Peterson and several other neighbors standing on the sidewalk, pointing up at the sky. More people were coming out of their houses as word spread that a military jet was circling overhead in obvious distress. Some people were taking pictures with their phones. Others were calling the police or the fire department. Nobody understood what was really happening except Sarah. "Falcon 27, I have been studying topographical maps and satellite images of this entire region. I found something that might work, but it is going to be challenging. There is an old airstrip about 12 miles northeast of your current position." Sarah had discovered the abandoned runway while searching through historical maps on her computer. It was built during World War II as a training base for bomber pilots. After the war ended, The military closed the base and gave the land to the state. For the past 60 years, it had been mostly forgotten, hidden in a forest preserve that few people ever visited. Ground control. I am not showing any airstrip on my navigation charts. Are you sure this runway still exists? Affirmative, Falcon 27. I am looking at recent satellite photos right now. The runway is partially overgrown but still intact. It is concrete construction, approximately 6,000 feet long and 150 feet wide. No buildings or obstacles at either end. Sarah had measured everything carefully. A damaged F-16 needed at least 4,000 feet of runway to land safely, even with perfect conditions. This old airstrip would give Lieutenant Morrison some extra room for error. More importantly, it was far enough from town that if something went wrong during the landing, no civilians would be hurt. Sarah's phone started ringing. She ignored it. Then her doorbell rang. Through her window, she could see Mrs. Peterson standing on her front porch, looking worried and confused. Sarah felt bad about ignoring her kind neighbor, but right now she could not stop to explain anything. Lieutenant Morrison was running out of time and fuel. Ground control. My fuel gauge is showing less than 2 minutes remaining. Whatever we are going to do, we need to do it right now. Sarah could hear the stress in the pilot's voice getting stronger. She had talked to many young aviators in similar situations during her military career. The key was to keep them focused on flying, while she handled all the planning and navigation. Panic was the enemy of good decision-making. Falcon 27, I am going to guide you to the airstrip using landmark navigation. I need you to look for a water tower with red and white stripes about 2 miles northeast of your position. Do you see it? Sarah was looking at the same water tower through her kitchen window. It was the tallest structure for miles around and should be easy to spot from the air. She watched Lieutenant Morrison's F-16 turn toward the northeast and adjust his flight path. I have the water tower in sight, ground control. Red and white stripes, just like you said. Perfect. Now I need you to fly directly over that water tower and continue northeast for exactly 1 minute. You should see a small lake shaped like a horseshoe. The airstrip is in the forest on the north side of that lake. Sarah grabbed her purse and car keys. She needed to get to a position where she could see the airstrip directly and provide visual guidance for the final approach. The satellite images on her computer were helpful, but she needed to see the actual runway conditions with her own eyes. Mrs. Peterson, I have to go somewhere right now, but I will explain everything later, Sarah called out as she ran to her car. Mrs. Peterson looked shocked. In 15 years of living next door to Sarah, she had never seen her neighbor move so fast or sound so urgent about anything. Sarah drove through Millbrook faster than she had ever driven before. She knew exactly where she needed to go. There was a hill about 2 miles from the old airstrip that would give her a clear view of the landing approach. She had hiked there once years ago and remembered that it offered a perfect observation point. Falcon 27. Do you see the horseshoe? Lake? Affirmative, ground control. I can see a lake that looks like a horseshoe, but I am not seeing any runway. Are you sure about this location? Sarah pulled her car to the top of the hill and jumped out with a pair of old binoculars she kept in her glove compartment. Through the lenses, she could see the abandoned airstrip clearly. 60 years of weather and neglect had taken their toll. Weeds grew through cracks in the concrete, and small trees had sprouted along the edges. But the basic runway was still there and still usable. Falcon 27. The runway is there, but it is camouflaged by vegetation. Look for a straight line through the forest on the north side of the lake. It will look like a gap in the trees. Sarah watched through her binoculars as the F-16 circled lower over the forest. She could see Lieutenant Morrison searching desperately for the runway that would save his life. I think I see it, ground control. There is definitely a straight line through the trees. It looks like an old road or maybe a fire break. That is your runway, Falcon 27. I am now in position to provide visual guidance for your approach. Current wind is from the southwest at approximately 10 knots. I recommend approaching from the west and landing toward the east. Sarah had moved to a position where she could see both the airstrip and the F-16 at the same time. Lieutenant Morrison was down to less than 2,000 feet altitude and probably had less than 1 minute of fuel remaining. This landing was going to happen right now, whether they were ready or not. Ground control, I am starting my final approach. My airspeed is 140 knots and dropping. I still cannot see the runway clearly, but I am trusting you completely. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility that she had not experienced since her military days. A young man's life depended entirely on her knowledge and judgment. If she made a mistake in her calculations or gave him the wrong guidance, Lieutenant Morrison would die, and it would be her fault. But Sarah also felt something else she had not experienced in 20 years. She felt like Captain Martinez again. She felt like the person she was meant to be. Sarah stood on the hilltop holding her binoculars with both hands to keep them steady. Through the lenses, she could see Lieutenant Morrison's F-16 lining up for what might be the most dangerous landing attempt in the history of military aviation. The abandoned runway looked tiny from this distance, like a narrow concrete ribbon hidden in an ocean of green forest. Falcon 2-7, you are slightly right of centerline. Adjust your heading 2 degrees to the left and maintain your current. Descent rate? Sarah's voice was calm and professional, but inside she was terrified. She had guided many aircraft to emergency landings during her military career, but never anything like this. Those landings had been on proper military airfields, with fire trucks and medical teams standing by. This was just an old strip of cracked concrete that had not seen an aircraft in decades. Ground control. I can see the runway now. It looks pretty. Rough, but it is definitely long enough. My airspeed is 120 knots. I am committed to this approach. Lieutenant Morrison's F-16 was gliding silently through the morning sky like a huge metal bird with broken wings. Sarah could no longer hear his engine because there was no engine. The young pilot was flying a dead aircraft using only momentum and gravity and whatever flying skills he possessed. Sarah grabbed her cell phone with her free hand and dialed 911 while still watching the approach through her binoculars. This is 911 Emergency Services. What is your emergency? This is Sarah Martinez. I am at the old airfield in Millfield Forest Preserve. A military aircraft is making an emergency landing here right now. We need fire trucks, ambulances, and police. Immediately. Ma'am, did you say a military aircraft? Yes. An F-16 fighter jet with engine failure. The pilot is attempting to land in approximately 30 seconds. Please send emergency vehicles to the Forest Preserve access road off Highway 9. Sarah hung up before the dispatcher could ask more questions. She needed to focus completely on helping Lieutenant Morrison complete this landing safely. Falcon 2-7, you are looking good on approach. Your angle is perfect and you are lined up with the center line of the runway. Prepare for touchdown in 15 seconds. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see that the F-16 was flying lower and slower than she had ever seen a fighter jet fly. Lieutenant Morrison was using every bit of his skill to keep the aircraft controlled without engine power. One small mistake would send the jet cartwheeling across the forest in a ball of fire and twisted metal. Ground control, I can see the runway surface now. There are some cracks and weeds, but it looks solid. I am going to touch down about 1,000 feet from the beginning of the runway to give myself maximum rollout distance. Sarah held her breath as she watched the F-16 drop toward the concrete strip. The aircraft looked enormous compared to the narrow runway. The landing gear was down and locked. The pilot's canopy was closed. Everything was as ready as it could be for this desperate gamble. Touchdown, 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 Lieutenant Morrison's voice crackled through the radio as his aircraft's main landing gear hit the old concrete. But the landing was far from smooth. The F-16 hit the runway hard and bounced back into the air. Sarah watched in horror as the aircraft flew about 50 feet above the concrete before coming down again even harder. The second impact sent sparks flying as the landing gear absorbed. Tremendous force. Falcon 2-7, are you okay? I saw a very hard touchdown. I am okay. Ground control. The aircraft is rolling and I still have steering control, but I am going very fast and this runway is rougher than it looked from the air. Sarah could see the F-16 racing down the old airstrip much faster than normal. Without engine power to help slow the aircraft, Lieutenant Morrison was depending entirely on his wheel brakes and the natural drag of the airplane. But the concrete was covered with decades of dirt and small debris that made braking less effective. Halfway down the runway, Sarah saw something that made her heart stop. Smoke was rising from the F-16's landing gear. The brakes were overheating from the extreme effort of stopping a heavy aircraft that was moving too fast. If the brakes failed completely, Lieutenant Morrison would roll off the end of the runway and into the forest at high speed. Falcon 27, I can see smoke from your brakes. How much runway do you have remaining? Ground control, I estimate about 2,000 feet of concrete left. The brakes are getting mushy, but they are still working. I think I can get this. Bird stopped. Sarah watched through her binoculars as the F-16 continued rolling down the runway. The aircraft was definitely slowing down, but not as quickly as it needed to. The forest at the end of the runway was getting closer and closer. Sarah could see individual trees that would destroy the aircraft if Lieutenant Morrison could not get stopped in time. Come on, come on, come on, Sarah whispered to herself as she watched the drama unfold below. With about 500 feet of runway remaining, the F-16 finally slowed to taxi speed. Lieutenant Morrison was able to steer the aircraft to the left side of the runway where it rolled to a complete stop just 200 feet from the tree line. For several seconds, everything was quiet except for the sound of hot metal cooling and the distant sirens of approaching emergency vehicles. Falcon 27, are you injured? Do you need immediate medical assistance? Negative, ground control. I am shaken up, but not hurt. The aircraft is secure, and I am shutting down all systems. That was the scariest 10 minutes of my entire life. Sarah sat down on the ground and realized that her legs were shaking. She had just watched a young man cheat death using nothing but skill, courage, and a runway that most people had forgotten existed. Lieutenant Morrison had pulled off a landing that would be talked about in military circles for years to come. Ground. Control, I do not know who you are, but you just saved my life. I need to ask you something important. Are you former military? Sarah looked down at the old airstrip where fire trucks and ambulances were now arriving. She could see Lieutenant Morrison climbing out of his cockpit and walking around his aircraft to check for damage. The young pilot was safe on the ground, and that was all that mattered to Sarah. Affirmative, Falcon 27. Former Air Force. I served 8 years as a radar technician and communications specialist. Well, you still have all the skills. That was some of the best ground control work I have ever experienced. I owe you my life, and I will never forget it. Sarah smiled for the first time in hours. She had not felt this good about herself since she left the military 20 years ago. For a few minutes, she had been Captain Martinez again, using her training and experience to save someone's life. It felt like coming home after a very long journey. Emergency vehicles were now surrounding the F-16, and Lieutenant Morrison was talking to paramedics and fire department officials. The crisis was over, and everyone was safe. Sarah walked back to her car and drove toward home. She knew that her quiet life in Millbrook was about to become very complicated, but for right now, she felt something she had not felt in 2 decades. She felt proud of who she was and what she could do when people needed help. By Wednesday morning, Sarah's life had changed completely and forever. What started as a quiet Tuesday helping a pilot in distress had turned into the biggest news story Millbrook had ever seen. Sarah woke up to find news vans parked outside, her apartment building, and reporters knocking on her door asking for interviews. The story had begun spreading the night before when Lieutenant Morrison returned to Peterson Air Force Base and filed his incident report. Military investigators needed to understand exactly what had happened during the emergency landing. When they traced the radio communications back to Sarah's apartment, they discovered something remarkable. The person who had guided an F-16 to safety was a former Air Force captain who had been living quietly in Millbrook for 20 years. Lieutenant Morrison had spent Tuesday evening trying to find out who had saved his life. When military officials told him about Sarah's background, he immediately asked for permission to drive down to Millbrook and thank her in person. The Air Force agreed and also sent their own investigators to interview Sarah about the emergency landing. Sarah had not slept much Tuesday night. She kept thinking about Lieutenant Morrison and how young he had sounded over the radio. She thought about Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez and Sergeant Tom Wilson, her friends who had died in Afghanistan. She wondered what they would think about her, hiding from her military past for so many years. When Sarah looked out her kitchen window Wednesday morning, she was shocked to see all the activity on Maple Street. 3 news vans were parked along the curb. Reporters were setting up cameras and interviewing her neighbors. Mrs. Peterson was standing on her front porch talking to a woman with a microphone. Sarah's phone had been ringing since 6 in the morning, but she was afraid to answer it. She knew that once this story got out, her quiet life would be over. Everyone in Millbrook would know about her military service and her hidden past. Sarah was not sure she was ready for that kind of attention. At 8:30, there was a knock on Sarah's front door. She looked through the window and saw a young man in a military dress uniform standing on her porch. Even though she had only heard his voice over the radio, Sarah knew immediately that this was Lieutenant Morrison. He was taller than she had imagined, with short dark hair and serious brown eyes. "Ms. Martinez, I am Lieutenant Jake Morrison. I believe we spoke yesterday morning under rather difficult circumstances." Sarah opened the door and invited him inside. Lieutenant Morrison looked around her small apartment with obvious curiosity. This was where the person who had saved his life had lived quietly for 20 years without anyone knowing who she really was. "Lieutenant, I am glad to see that you are okay. How is your aircraft?" "The F-16 survived the landing with only minor damage. The maintenance crew says it can be repaired and returned to service within a month. But that is not why I am here. I came to thank you for what you did yesterday. Without your help, I would not have survived." Sarah offered Lieutenant Morrison coffee, and they sat at her kitchen table where she had spread out maps and coordinated the emergency landing. The young pilot looked at the old military radio and the maps with amazement. "I have been flying for 3 years, and I have never heard anyone provide ground control like you did yesterday. You were calm, professional, and you made perfect decisions under pressure. Where did you learn to do that?" Sarah went to her bedroom closet and brought out the wooden box she had kept hidden for so many years. She showed Lieutenant Morrison the photographs, medals, and letters from her Air Force career. As she told him about her 8 years of military service, Sarah felt like she was talking about someone else's life. "I guided hundreds of aircraft during my time in the Air Force, but after I lost 2 close friends in Afghanistan, I could not handle the responsibility anymore. I was afraid that if I made a mistake, someone else would die because of me." Lieutenant Morrison studied the photographs of Sarah in uniform, standing with other soldiers. She looked confident and happy in those old pictures, very different from the quiet woman who worked night shifts at the electronics factory. "Captain Martinez, you did not make any mistakes yesterday. You made perfect decisions that saved my life and protected everyone in this town. You should be proud of your service, not hiding from it." At 10 o'clock, Mrs. Peterson knocked on Sarah's door. She was followed by Mayor Williams, Chief of Police Johnson, and several other town officials. Word was spreading quickly that their quiet neighbor was actually a military hero. "Sarah, why did you never tell us about your service?" Mrs. Peterson asked with tears in her eyes. "All these years I thought you were just being shy. I never knew you were carrying so much inside." By noon, the story was on national news. Television reporters were calling Lieutenant Morrison's emergency, landing one of the most skillful pieces of flying they had ever seen. But they were even more interested in Sarah, the mysterious former Air Force captain who had emerged from retirement to guide a fighter jet to safety. Sarah found herself surrounded by reporters, cameras, and microphones. The mayor wanted to give her the key to the city. The Air Force wanted to bring her back as a civilian consultant. Representatives from aerospace companies wanted to offer her jobs. Everyone wanted to know why she had hidden her military background for so many years. "I left the Air Force because I thought I was not strong enough to handle the responsibility anymore," Sarah told the reporters. But yesterday I learned that sometimes the best way to honor the people you have lost is to keep using the skills they helped you develop. Lieutenant Morrison stood beside Sarah as she answered questions from the media. He had insisted on staying in Millbrook until the press conference was over. He wanted everyone to know that Sarah had saved his life with skill and courage that came from years of military training and experience. Captain Martinez did not just guide my aircraft to a runway yesterday, Lieutenant Morrison told the reporters. She gave me hope when I thought I was going to die. Her voice was the most beautiful sound I have ever heard because it meant that someone was fighting to bring me home safely. That afternoon, Sarah walked through downtown Millbrook for the first time since the story broke. People she had known for years were looking at her with new eyes. The woman who had quietly supervised the night shift at Henderson Electronics was actually a decorated war veteran who had served her country with distinction. Mr. Henderson found Sarah at Chen's grocery and shook her hand firmly. "Sarah, I always knew there was something special about you. Now I understand why you were so good with technical equipment and why you never got rattled when things went wrong. You have been welcome to work at my factory for as long as you want, but I suspect you might have some better offers coming your way." Sarah bought her usual groceries and drove home to her apartment on Maple Street. The news vans were gone and the reporters had moved on to other stories. Mrs. Peterson was watering her plants and waved at Sarah just like she had done every day for 15 years. But now Mrs. Peterson's wave looked different. It looked proud. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table and looked at the old military radio that had been silent for 20 years until yesterday morning. She thought about Lieutenant Morrison and how grateful she felt to have been able to help him. She thought about Maria and Tom and all the other friends she had lost during her military career. For the first time in 20 years, Sarah did not feel guilty about surviving when her friends had not. She realized that hiding from her past had not honored their memory. Using her skills to save Lieutenant Morrison's life had honored their memory. Sarah opened the wooden box and looked at her old photographs one more time. Then she put the box on her bookshelf where she could see it every day. Captain Sarah Martinez was no longer hiding. She was home.